I've had some questions about chapter 11, study problem 3 for this coming exam. And so I've got it replicated here. Um, I'll go through one. I think I guess I can do two briefly. Um, if you observe, and then 3, and the rest of them will go through one by one by. Let's get started. Oops. Got a picture of an oil well here. Got a white page here. All we need to get at this question is the market for oil. We don't need to worry too much about the firm um, for the questions being asked here. You can always, if in doubt, you can always do the side by side, but the market panel will get us where we need to go here. Let's start at initial long run equilibrium. We'll assume. Oh, the key to the oil industry is to map your demand and supply really steep. That's how you show that inelastic demand in the short run and inelastic supply in the short run. So let's redo those. Demand is really steep, supply is really steep, and we're at some initial equilibrium, we assume, and let's get started. So the first event that this problem asks us to think about in the short and the long run, and they throw a little bit of a nuance into the long run, but let's start with the short run. Here it's a demand event. India and China, citizens in India and China are getting richer. They start consuming more of a lot of things, including oil. We notice that in this setting where both the supply and the demand curve are quite steep, a small demand event is going to lead to a big price change. And that's why we see the steepness of both the demand and the supply curve tells us why price is so much more volatile than quantity is as events happen in this market. So that's the short run event. I'm not going to, I guess if I had shown the side-by-side firm level curve, we would see that firms are making a profit. There's going to be entry or expansion by incumbent firms. All right, this chapter throws us a little bit of a new thing that there's two things going to happen in the long run. One is there's entry as suppliers realize that oil prices are high and that there's money to be made. But there's this other newer phenomenon in the rich countries. People, maybe not early, but over time, people realize, wow, prices are high, they're going to stay high. We're going to start conserving. We're going to act in a way that uses less fuel. So over in the short run, you're stuck commuting to your job by the car that you have, but in the long run, you get a new job. You can maybe get it closer to where you live or move closer to your work. You can, in the long run, if oil prices are high when your SUV needs replacing, you can get a Prius. So in the short run, you're sort of stuck, but in the long run, you can adjust. So they're asking us to think about long run supply adjustment, and we know that that's entry. Long run demand adjustment, that's going to happen as consumers react to the higher prices by demanding more. So in this case, the entry will push the new supply curve to the right, but even while that's going on, there's conservation measures going. Consumers are using less fuel because of the higher price, and over time, that the combination of those events lead us back to the long run equilibrium price. So we end up at Q2. I modeled this oil industry in this case as a constant cost industry. That's really not the case because the easy, cheap places to get oil tend to be in the Middle East. Those are already being tapped. as new exploration happens, we're getting it from fracking, which gets a lot of oil, but it's pretty expensive oil relative to the oil that pumps out of the ground in Saudi Arabia or Libya. So there's ever more marginal reserves being tapped as price goes up. So, and as new entry, as capacity is increased, the new wells are in the harder areas to get the oil and refine the oil. The easy stuff has been found and is pumping already. All right, let's go ahead and look at a supply event briefly. Actually, I'm looking at the time on the screencast. I don't have that many minutes in my free upload capacity. So the supply event would be similar. You'd map a shift in the supply curve in the short run. There would be profits. That supply shock would lead to new entry. Well, let's think about that. Yeah, prices go up because of the loss of OPEC oil. That was the 70s event. Actually, that's when we saw the North Sea oil come online. We saw an increase in production in the U.S. So non-OPEC sources increased supply even as OPEC restricted supply. Price went up, but in the long view, not by as much because of these new supplies that came online. If you observed an oil price rise, how in principle could you tell whether it was driven by supply or demand side? Notice that here, quantity is going up with these demand events, both in the short run and the long run. In a supply shock, you'd see the opposite, that supply fell, price goes up, and market quantity goes down. So that's the difference. You look at quantities. If price is rising and quantity demand is going up, then you've got a demand event. If price is rising and quantity consumed is going down, then you've got a supply event. Let's think through another, this problem. This problem goes on. How would the diagram and the response shocks be different if there were a competitive market composed of many producers? That's the one we just did. Single monopoly oil producer, there the short run analytics would be the same, but if we have a monopoly producer, there isn't going to be the entry in response to the positive economic profits. Let's just show that case real quick. The monopoly case, this is, I'm not going to ask you for this on a test. This is the material that we didn't quite have time to cover during Module 4. Anyway, the monopolist faces a demand curve. A monopolist has associated with that a marginal revenue function that's everywhere below the demand curve. And that's simply because when a monopolist chooses to increase output, the monopolist knows it has to lower the price to increase output. And there's sort of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you get the new price when you sell an extra barrel of oil, say, but you've had to lower price and all the oil you were selling, now you have to discount. So that offsets the gain from the new production. Anyway, the bottom line is you've got a marginal cost function, a marginal revenue function. The profit maximizing price and quantity occurs where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. The price we read up off the demand curve, quantity is right there. Anyway, that's the short run, that's the long run equilibrium. Let's say the monopolist is making some level of profit. There are barriers to entry though in the monopoly case, so those profits aren't competed away. All right, now there's there's this demand increase. The new marginal revenue curve has the same y-intercept, it's twice as steep. Now there's an increase in output, there's an increase in price, but if we knew what average total costs were, let's just assume that they're here. Notice that profits were this small black rectangle, now they're this big blue rectangle. So monopolist profits have gone up, but if there were not barriers to entry, there wouldn't be a monopoly. So the monopoly is enjoying those high profits. There's not necessarily any further adjustment that's going to happen in the short run or the long run. Now, the question goes on and asks, why would individual OPEC members, an OPEC cartel. Cartel is just a bunch of firms acting together jointly as a monopolist. So a successful cartel will act just like a monopolist, but why would an individual OPEC member countries have an incentive to produce more than the quota assigned to them? Well, we see that in this graph, which we see both OPEC and non-OPEC. Notice that OPEC has restricted output and raised the price on oil, and non-OPEC countries have increasing marginal costs to get that oil out of the ground. But OPEC countries have pretty low marginal costs, and they just make the profits off of the high international world price. So in either case, the price of a barrel of oil is much higher than the cost of bringing that oil to market. And in that case, each individual producer has an incentive to raise price because, hey, I'm only just one producer. My extra chiseling is what they call it. My extra output isn't going to make a big change in the market price, and my citizens make a lot more money. Actually, a lot of these oil companies are nationalized in OPEC countries and elsewhere too sometimes. Anyway, the fact that they can make more money, so much more money by producing a little bit extra, that gives each of them the incentive to do so. So we see cartels break down all the time, including OPEC. OPEC has had some success, but it has many, many periods of failure to discipline its members to restrict output.